Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Zeller-Berkman, and I am the Director of Youth Studies Programs here at CUNY School of Professional Studies. So welcome to our January Community and Youth Organizing Speaker Series. We are so grateful to Professor Lumumba Bandele, who teaches our Community and Youth Organizing class, and also organizes this series for us every January. And it really captures the most pressing issues in the organizing space. And also, you know, he brings in incredible people that are at the forefront of movements and topics. So thank you. Today, we're going to be talking about vicarious trauma. And this is something that youth work professionals on this Zoom and whoever you are, actually, whoever has joined us tonight can really identify with in a deep way. And I'll just speak from the lens of youth and community workers and organizers for a second, but I know, you know, many of us know that sometimes, you know, their dreams are filled with what happened in family court the week before, or, you know, what was shared with them in one of those in-between moments between programming about some abuse that a young person is going through. And in this global pandemic, you know, I think youth workers were really supporting youth and their families through incredible loss and illness and instability. And so we are very lucky to have Iya Rev. DeShannon Bowens here with us tonight to talk about the impact of vicarious trauma and how we can care for our bodies, our minds, our spirits, as we help young people and their families and sometimes whole communities deal with both individual trauma, but also just, you know, the trauma of being in dehumanizing, oppressive, racist, patriarchal systems, right? And so anyway, hopefully through this conversation, we'll really talk about ways we can do this work and be in community in ways that feel sustainable over the long haul. So I'm going to pass it over to Professor Bandele to get us started. Thank you again for choosing to be with us here tonight for this really important conversation. Pass it to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and Happy New Year. To those of you who are in my class this semester, this winter session, welcome. It's good to see you again. We are going to have a very timely discussion this evening. And I am really honored to be joined by Iya Rev. DeShannon Bowens. And I have to say, I was introduced to Iya Rev. DeShannon Bowens through a friend and colleague who I've known for years, who, in fact, some of my students will be able to meet later this winter session, Quentin Walcott out of Connect NYC. And I'll talk a little bit more about Connect NYC and how they actually were responsible for introducing me to the concept of vicarious trauma. But let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. Iya Rev. DeShannon Bowens is the founder of ILERA Counseling and Education Services and works as a psychotherapist, professional development trainer, and spiritual counselor. Through ILERA, she offers workshops and programs focusing on sexuality and spirituality, sexual abuse, vicarious trauma, and wellness. Iya DeShannon received a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and a master's degree in counseling from Pace University. She has practiced the Ifa Orisha spiritual tradition for 20 years and is an initiated priestess. She was ordained as an interfaith minister, in 2010 through One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in Manhattan, and now serves as the co-director of the seminary. Reverend Iya DeShannon Bowens, welcome, and thank you so much for making time to join us and be with us this evening.
Well, thank you, Lumumba, for having me. I just want to show a lot of gratitude and appreciation to CUNY School of Professional Studies for all of you extending this warm welcome, and say Happy New Year to everybody who's on this call or on this Zoom tonight.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. So let me just lay a little context for the discussion this evening. As I stated, I was introduced to this term vicarious trauma through the amazing work of the folks over at Connect NYC. At that time, I was doing criminal justice work as the organizing director at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, much of my work was really centered around criminal justice. A large amount of it was in capital punishment. Much of what we were dealing with as capital punishment abolitionists, as organizers, some litigators, many people throughout the field, were a number of realities of the work. Here we are, people whose job it is to make sure a state does not execute a human being. So we have people's lives in our hands. I was one of the newer people to this work, but I began to just notice different things in my body. Whenever we got close to a possible death warrant being signed, which meant that this person was one step closer to being executed, all of that sends like different kinds of physical things through you, but also emotional and other things. We began to get closer to this possible death warrant being signed. And this was during the time I took my class to Connect NYC, and Q began to talk about the things that he had put in place for his staff, and how, because they were doing the work of helping to deal with the issue of gender-based violence, deal with the issue of overall community violence, that his staff was really taking on some of that direct trauma and other ways, and that he had to figure out some very specific things. And he said that what they're dealing with is vicarious trauma. And a light bulb went off in my head. And it made me realize that so many of us are dealing with this without actually having, number one, the language to identify it. And then number two, the proper mechanisms to address it, both individually, and then also those of us who are running these institutions institutionally. How do we make sure that we are creating an environment that sustains the ability of our staff to continue to do the work in a healthy, effective way? And so what we're going to do today is talk about those two places of engagement, individual and institutional. We have a mixture of people in the audience today. We have people who are coming from youth service work. We have educators. We have pre-K educators. We have people who do, we have folks from Alliance of Families for Justice. I see you in there. We have folks from the Movement for Black Lives. I see you in there. Folks from the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. We have a broad range of people, but we also have within that people who are direct service providers. And then we have mid-managers, and then we have executive directors. So we all want to figure out how we can do whatever it is at our disposal to begin to address some of these issues. So let's start off first and foremost by talking specifically about vicarious trauma in terms of defining the term itself, and then also when was this concept first discovered and how did it come on the scene?
Thank you, Lumumba. So we have a lot to unpack. We're going to see how we do with this. So let's do a dive in terms of the definition of vicarious trauma. But before we even get to that, let's just speak about trauma. I like to give a very general definition, something very simple and accessible that I often use. And that's to say that trauma is a shock or an offense to an individual system, a collective, a community that changes the nature of who we are as individuals and who we are as communities. So that is a general definition of trauma, a shock or an offense to a person, a community, a collective that changes the nature of who that individual or community or collective is. So we are not the same as we once were when trauma happens, when trauma impacts us. So very simple. So when we talk about vicarious trauma, how that comes on the scene is that is a cumulative effect. So vicarious trauma is a cumulative effect of being exposed to trauma over time as a result of our interaction and engagement with people who have been traumatized. And so what that means is that we don't have to experience the trauma directly ourselves. It is indirect. And it also is because we have open hearts when we do this work. So you just listed a very diverse cross-section of people who I would say have open hearts. So everybody on this call who is engaged, You do the work that you do because you care. You do the work that you do because you're empathic. You do the work that you do because it matters to you and you want to make a difference. And as a result of that work, when you're dealing with people who have experienced with trauma, you are inevitably going to be affected because we're connected to each other. We don't move about this planet in isolation. We feel. It's why most of us have reactions when we see a young person cry or somebody's hurt. If we're walking down the street, if we see someone fall, usually people turn around. Some will keep walking, but some turn around. Sometimes we even have a physical reaction like, ooh, I felt that. It's because we're connected. And so vicarious trauma is part of, it's par for course, basically. And it's something that I wish that I had been told when I was in graduate school. So that's the first part. Did you want me to answer the second part about
Please,
when
yes, absolutely. Yes, please.
Okay. So ironically, this came on the scene in 1990. There was a doctor, I believe her name was Lori Perelman. I may be saying her last name wrong, but she wrote this article in 1990 with someone else whose last name is McCann. And they came up with this term called vicarious traumatization. And that came about because they were really looking at the work of psychotherapists and psychologists and how they were being impacted by working with victims of trauma. And so basically they coined that term in 1990, vicarious traumatization. And then as they kept on doing their research, looking at people who were doing anti-violence work and other sectors of work that dealt with trauma, they shortened it to vicarious trauma. And then they came up with a little acronym called VT. So throughout our conversation today, you may hear me say VT. And when I say VT, I'm speaking of vicarious trauma.
Great. So I'll use that term also, VT. Thank you. In the early spring of 2020, we know the world was beginning the process of being changed. Public advocate Jumaane Williams at a press conference in response to the uprisings that were happening, particularly in New York City around the murder of George Floyd, came to the microphone and said simply, "I am not okay." He proceeded to cry. He said, "I am not okay." As a government official, as someone responsible for coming up with remedies to deal with the situations that the entire city of New York is undergoing, for him to say, "I am not okay," was severely significant, extremely significant. But what it did, and what he did say also, was that he wants to give permission for other people to not be okay, to say that. How does VT show up? What are some ways that people can say, maybe I have been impacted by this, maybe I have not? How does it show up? Some of the ways it shows up in people.
Okay, well, it's different for every person because we all respond to trauma differently. So I'd like to just give a couple examples, and one of them I tell often because I was blessed to have a psychologist attend one of my early trainings. I've been working with Connect in terms of vicarious trauma for the last 10 years in terms of coming there and doing training. So they were one of the early people who signed on. And one of those sessions, we were fortunate enough to have a psychologist just come in because she realized that she needed this for herself because of the work that she did. Twice a week, she would see a war veteran, and this person was suffering from PTSD. Every time before, actually during the session, when she met with him, his knee would shake. So I'm sure that many of you are aware of sometimes you may have a nervous twitch. You may notice that you drum your fingers, that your knee bounces up and down, different things with your body. Well, this is something that would happen with him. Knee would bounce up and down all the time during the session. What she noticed happened in herself is that about 5 minutes before the session, let's say session is at 12 o'clock, at 11:55 a.m., before the client came in the room, her knee started to bounce up and down. This was something that she never experienced before. So what she realized is that she was starting to have experience a symptom of vicarious trauma herself. So she took action and she cut the sessions down from 2 times a week to 1 time a week. Why did she do that? That was an immediate action that she could take for her own self-care. She needed to learn how to put a boundary up so that she could function through the day, so that she could be more present with her own clients. So when you ask about how it shows up, one of the things that we have to do is develop awareness. We have to tune into our own bodies. That's the first thing. Some effects of vicarious trauma can be things like anger, because we're taking in a lot of trauma stories that we hear from people. We are witnessing trauma. Some of the things that we want to express in the work that we do, we can't because we have to, maintain a professional appearance. And so then what happens is that anger will get channeled out into places where someone can't talk back. So let's say that if you're experiencing vicarious trauma at work, you take the anger at home with your loved ones, with your friends, with children. That's one way. Another way that vicarious trauma can show up is alienation. So it is so intense, the trauma that we're taking in noticing of other people, that we're avoiding people, places, things, and situations that remind us of work. And so we go within, we isolate. And isolation is different from healthy escape. Isolation doesn't help us to address vicarious trauma in our lives or help us to heal. It actually has us going within. Escape is something different, where sometimes we just need to take a little break. So we need to put a pause on it, take a day or two, take a mini vacation. Healthy escape, but isolation usually does not help us. And then another way is diminished awareness. So that means that all of the things that we're taking into our environment are so intense that we're not conscious, we're not aware. Something as simple as walking, we start tripping over things, we're having accidents. Some of the same signs of trauma in general that people experience, you will also experience in vicarious trauma. So flashbacks, you finding that you talk about work all the time and you can't stop. You're talking about the organizing that you do all the time and that you can't stop. It's like the thoughts are intruding your ability to be present with other people. And then, of course, Lumumba, there's the signs of your body. Things like heart palpitations, nervous twitching, which I talked about earlier, loss of appetite, sometimes emotional outbursts. So there's many different ways that this shows up. It's different for every person, but in order to get clear on what's happening with me, you need to sit down and do an assessment to increase your awareness. How is this showing up in my life? What's different after I've interacted with that coworker, that colleague who has trauma, and now that trauma is affecting me?
That's helpful. Thank you. As you said, most of us do this work because some of us see it as a calling, some of us, directed, but we all are doing this work because we are attached to it. We are committed to it. Most of us do this work with a understanding of the need for a level of resilience. Talk to me about how we balance this concept of being resilient, with also trying to make sure that we are caring for ourselves, right? This is not easy stuff. We want to be able to plow through the hard times. It's not pleasant. It's not, rosy red stuff. It's difficult stuff. And we come to this work because we want to be able to change those material conditions, right? And that requires us to toughen up a bit, right? But how do we create that balance between being resilient to get through those difficult moments, and sometimes those moments are years, but how do we create that balance with being resilient enough to be effective, but also not taking on all of the work that then begins to be symptoms of VT?
That's a great question. So the first two things that come to mind is sustainable self-care and boundaries. But before I talk about sustainable self-care and boundaries, I just want to say a word about resiliency, because I remember when all of these research studies were coming out in the 90s about resiliency. And I remember being in one of my classes, my African-American psychology class, and everybody was talking about resiliency and the resiliency of African-Americans because of work that was coming from out of Black psychology at that time. And as I've sat with that, and as time has gone on, I've been in different circles, and I've saw people sit back and say, wow, particularly as they're referring to activists and people doing this direct service social work, that, oh, so-and-so is so resilient. They're so resilient. And what I want us to be mindful of is that there are some things that should not require our resilience. At some point, it's not okay. We should not have to plow through and work and take on trauma and oppression, injustice, and disrespect to the point that it depletes us. And so I want to encourage everybody, whatever cultural group you come from, your own ancestry, look at the patterns of how your own family line handled stress, how they dealt with resiliency, and how that impacted their health. And is that something that is good for you? Sometimes it's not. So that leads me back to the thing about boundaries. We don't have to say yes to everything. No is a complete sentence, and no is a sacred word that requires no explanation. We must learn how to use our voice and to say no. When you say no, it teaches others how to respect you and what you will and what you will not do. So that's the first thing, no, boundaries. The second thing is sustainable self-care. So self-care is going on like, I've seen it going around like a hashtag, and everybody is using it like it's the latest new fashion design or something. And that's great and all, okay? But one, self-care sometimes is hard to do by yourself. We need each other, we need community, and it needs to be sustainable. What do I mean by that? It needs to be something that you can do on an ongoing basis. Otherwise, you will have difficulty being able to address the effects of vicarious trauma, let alone being able to get to kind of see the signs when they come beforehand. So they need to, sustainable is something that is cultivating enough energy for you to keep you going over time. So you may look at something online that says, oh, the latest self-care trend is to meditate and to sit in silence on a cushion for 30 minutes. Well, you might not be able to sit down on a cushion. You might not like being quiet for 30 minutes. That might not be your thing. That's okay. Meditation might not be for you. Is meditation a great tool? Yes, and it's scientifically proven, but that might not be for you. Maybe you need to get up and walk. Maybe walking meditation is your thing. That's a meditation too. Maybe running on the treadmill or running outside is your thing. So whatever action that you do for your own self-care, and what I like to also say self-nurturing, has to be something that you can maintain.
You know, we're in a process here just through this discussion alone of learning and unlearning. You know, learning new things, but we're also now being forced to unlearn certain things, you know, around resilience, but also, you know, many of us grew up with this idea of what we were told, that if it don't kill you, it makes you stronger, right? And for those of us who come out of particularly grassroots, radical organizing, you know, your commitment to the work was really measured by how much you sacrifice, right? How much you left out in the street, how much you left in meetings, whatever it is. But if you had time to get 8 hours of sleep, if you had time to be with your family, if you had time to do some joy, you weren't really about this work, right? And so we're now in the process of unlearning some of these things. And I see people amening in the chat about no being a complete sentence. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more of that in many of our institutions when we leave here. But talk to us also about some of the other individual practices that we can do. You mentioned something around, you mentioned meditation, if that works. You mentioned walking. What are some other things, some other tools that people can just access if they find themselves showing some of these symptoms, if they want to actually prevent some of these things from happening. You talked about boundaries, so I think that's really specific. And I want to come to a little bit later, some institutional responses to that. But what are some other tools that people can actually begin to utilize?
Okay, there's a plethora of things. And before I go down the list, I'd actually like to invite us all to practice something together right now, if everyone's okay with that. So there is a process called Interoception Awareness. And I just learned this last year. I get excited when I learn new things. So Interoception Awareness, what is that? That is when we are tuning in to internally what is going on with our bodily state. Now, how do we practice interoception awareness? We practice it by tuning into our environmental cues. So the first thing that we do is we tune into the environmental cues through the senses. So in this moment, I want us all to engage in this as we can. And just where you are right now, the first thing, let's tune into, what do you see in this moment? Just right now with sight, if you can see, if you can, what do you see? I see the screen. I see the ring light. I see a table around me. I see a picture across from me. The next, what do you hear? I can hear a heater right now, keeping me warm and keeping me from twitching. The third, what do you smell in this moment? In my environment, I smell the faint scent of incense. Next, what do you taste in this moment right now? What do you taste? Right now, I don't taste anything really. I had water, nothing other than my own saliva. And then the fifth thing, what are you touching? What can you feel right now? I'm aware of how my sweater is touching my skin. I'm aware of my bottom on the seat of the chair. And now that you've tuned into that, how do you feel? Put that in the chat, like right now that you've tuned in through your five senses and becoming aware of your environment. How do you feel right now? And I see some coming in. I see safe, feeling calm, relaxed, decompress, comforted, present.
Joy. Welcome. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you see how long that took. That didn't take a lot of time at all. So that's one practice that you can do. Mm-hmm. There is what we call the ABCs of sustainable self-care, as well as the ABCs to addressing vicarious trauma. And they are three things. The A is for awareness, the B is for balance, and the C is for connection. Awareness, balance, and connection. And just so you all know, I have just a brief one-page sheet, and I'm going to upload this into Zoom chat before we get to the Q&A portion of our time together. And CUNY is also going to send it out to folks who signed up. So you'll have it even if you don't catch it live on here tonight. But practicing awareness, balance, and connection. That exercise that we just did addresses all three, because we tuned into being aware of our environment. And by doing that, it brings us in balance with our surrounding and where we are in this moment. And the C connects us to where we are in this moment. And all of us doing that together, those of us who could participate in it, we're connected to each other. So we did it right then and there. Awareness, balance, and connection. That's one exercise. And again, the word of the day, in fact, use it for 2022, interoception awareness. Interoception awareness. and we practice it through environmental cues. So in terms of some other exercises and things that folks can do, I saw it come through the chat: breath work, deep breathing, especially when we're stressful. Sometimes if you see that coworker, that client, that friend, that family member who is going through something, just taking a breath before you respond to a text, taking a breath before you read that email, taking a breath before you answer the phone. Breath work, deep breathing. Getting out in nature. Some people say, oh, I don't like nature. I'm not for bugs. Okay, fine. That's not your thing. Cool. You don't have to go out in nature. But some place where you can, you feel like you can have a deeper exhale, so to speak. Massages. If you are okay with people touching your body, massaging your own feet and your own hands. We have, gosh, I'm drawing a blank here, meridians throughout our body. And when we touch certain points in our hands and our feet, our body reacts just by massaging that. Music. What kind of music do you listen to that can take you in a different state, that can ground you, that can presence you? Dancing, helping you release tension. Spiritual practice, rituals. We're doing ritual every day. How you get up and make up your bed, fold up the futon, brush your teeth, that is all a ritual. And spiritual practice. What kind of spiritual practices do you do? What helps you to connect with something larger than yourself? All of those are things that we can do to address vicarious trauma. And when it's really deep, and Daryl, it is interoception awareness. Let me pause. I want to type this into the chat for the good folks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, 1 second. For everyone, interoception awareness. There you go.
Interoception. Okay.
Interoception. I do still have a St. Louis accent.
I love it.
Where was I? I was speaking about, oh yes, let me say this one more thing, Lumumba, and that is in terms of long-term, work with someone. Sometimes you need to work with someone. So work with a counselor who specializes in practice. And I saw somatic practices coming in. Yes, thank you for that. Somatic practices, contemplative practices, mindfulness practices. Work with someone else who can guide you in that. People who do body work. You can work with someone for that. It just doesn't have to be yoga. There's people who do all sorts of different things that can help us heal from the effects of this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was my next question in terms of long term. So all of these things are very useful tools for it. And it sounds like what you're suggesting here is that there needs to be an adjustment in not just professional culture, but it seems like in our own lives as well. Right. So if we're doing some of these things to deal with issues at work, what are some of the long-term strategies that we need to begin to utilize or integrate to help us mitigate some of these things before they become issues?
Okay. So I'll share an example of something which I realized I didn't share with you all how I came into the vicarious trauma work. I think I said at the beginning that I wish that we had had this in graduate school. We did not. We did not. Thank goodness I was saved, and some friends and colleagues of mine invited me into a collective. It was a women's wellness program at Garrison Institute up in New York. In Garrison, I guess they had a grant or something like that to work with domestic violence agencies. And so they needed another therapist, and so they invited me in. I had never heard of vicarious trauma, so I learned through them. We would travel to different domestic violence agencies in New York and New Jersey, and we would work with everyone from the bookkeeper to the executive director to the social workers to people who were working with the children. And we worked with everyone one-on-one, taking them through the same education, the same contemplative practices. We had people who specialized in yoga, psychotherapists, created a program to deliver. What one agency did, I'm trying to recall, it doesn't matter, either in New York or New Jersey, is that they actually created a wellness section in the administrative offices of the agency. And so what that meant is that they had this big plush couch. And this is, when we were still playing CDs. So they had a big system where you could pop in whatever CDs that you wanted. They had nice headphones. You had to sign up for it. So that was called the wellness section. And so just having that there, they also were bringing in people who could do yoga, who could do meditation. So they kept it going. After we came in and trained everybody, they kept bringing in people who specialized in those services in their area. And it made a huge difference. They also created a system where and I suggest this to all of you, find somebody that you can talk to, that you're close to and that you trust, wherever you're organizing, wherever you work, that you can let them know, hey, I'm being impacted by this work, and where they can cover you so a person doesn't feel like it's all on them. You might be activated by a particular client, or maybe even a colleague that's activating you and you weren't aware of it until you started getting into the work. You need someone that you can talk to who can help you handle that load. So organizations need to create ways for people to be able to talk to them about the way that the work is impacting them, and then not be punitive. That's part of the issue, is that, oh, so-and-so can't take it. This is trauma.
That's right.
This is trauma. And so thank you for who put in, sometimes there are not enough safe spaces at work. So if there are not, then who can you go to outside of work? And I say this because I've seen it happen. Sometimes when workplaces are not safe and they are not doing enough to take their responsibility to guarantee your safety as best as they can, it's time to leave.
That's right.
I ran into a woman on the subway several years ago after a training at Connect. I remember I was downtown Brooklyn, and I was so shocked. And I think I was actually on my way to a Connect event and ran into a woman, and she was like, "Thank you so much, DeShannon." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I remember. How are you doing?" She said, "Oh, good. I quit that job. I'm at a different place now. Thank you so much," because she wouldn't have quit if she hadn't taken the training. Sometimes vicarious trauma lets you know when you need to leave. But organizations have to take responsibility to have those resources in place, to create spaces where people can let them know how the work is impacting them without being punitive.
So let's dig into that a little bit deeper, because I want to have a real discussion about that. You know, some of us are at institutions now where they create some of these wellness spaces. You know, like you talked about, there's a nice little couch over here, there's dim lighting, there's tea, you know, but there's a culture of not wanting to utilize those things again, because, you know, of the different things it could actually imply. You're not up for it. You have other issues. You probably would not be able to take on the other work that they want to send to you. So all these other things go into people's minds as to why they don't want to access this. And I'm just talking specifically about some of my lived experiences at my previous workspace, right? Beautiful wellness little area, beautiful wellness area. Nobody was ever in it. Nobody ever utilized it, right? So let's talk about some professional adjustments that people can make. Here's why. I know we have on the call now people who are in leadership. I see some executive directors here. I see some people who are mid management, and I see some folks who are new. At some point, the new folks are going to be in mid management and or executive director level, right? So we're talking about a shift in organizational culture. We're talking about a shift in professional culture, if not just the organization. But what are some other things that people need to begin to integrate to change the way institutions actually address this dynamic? And how do we get people to actually recognize the necessity of really making those spaces being useful and being utilized by the staff?
There are so many thoughts going through my mind. Okay, the first is that starting with executives, because I'm a director at a organization myself. If you are an executive at an organization that is dealing with trauma and violence, oppression, and injustice, you yourself probably need some kind of support.
Can you say that one more time?
I will repeat it. If you are in a leadership position at an organization dealing with violence, trauma, oppression, injustice, etc., you probably need some kind of support, and you probably receive it as it relates to trauma. And I let my clients know, because I have a psychotherapy and spiritual counseling practice, even with my individual clients. I tell them, I say, look, I have somebody. That's why I'm able to show up the way that I do with you. You wouldn't want to work with me if I didn't have my support. So I think that when leaders are vulnerable enough to get their own support, that it's easier to support people within that organization that you're leading. So leaders need their own support. We have to change this narrative around vulnerability equaling weakness. Vulnerability is actually one of the most courageous things that you can show to people. It actually is more courageous to show vulnerability than to act like you don't have any. So I think that's one of the things in terms of changing the narrative within leadership is vulnerability. And I also want to voice that I know that's hard when you're working to keep families safe, thinking about social services and how we're looking to protect families and children and vulnerable people. And yet it's the thing that we need to bring in the balance, because if we don't allow room for vulnerability, we're going to break. We have to learn how to be flexible. So that we have to change that narrative, and also the narrative around work. And we have to ask ourselves, should we be modeling the same type of work structure and format as corporations? Should social services,
That's right,
youth services, all of these caring professions really be modeling that? Sometimes that model is very hurtful. So we need to come up with new ways, different hours of work. Is 40 to 60 hours of work really realistic dealing with trauma? No. Just like I remember a friend of mine, she was like, oh, DeShannon, you have to watch this special on the brain. This PBS special came out. And she was just running down all the facts to me. And I didn't watch it, so don't quote me. You all do your own research. But what came out from this, what she was telling me, is that those of us who are dealing with trauma actually need more sleep than the average person, because the body needs time to repair. So instead of 8 hours, this friend of mine, she would get 10. She said, I need 10 because of the stories that I'm taking in and what I see. So we got to get realistic. And if we want to get in the analytical bit of it, then just do research. Hire a research consultant to come into that organization and take an anonymous inventory of everyone. That's the before. Bring in the wellness practices. Bring in places to make the work environment a safer place, because I don't believe in safe space, but I believe that we can make places safer. Mm-hmm. So then bring in those practices, and then take another survey again and compare the results. Look at how your people are coming into the work, or in these COVID times showing up online, and look at the quality of the work and see what the difference is before and after.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. You know, I wanted to just make sure that people are recognizing how this is really necessary for them, because we have people who are doing education stuff, and some of them may not necessarily connect to trauma as a language or for how they are interacting, or the kind of impact that their work has on them. But I wanted to just make sure that people doing youth counseling, the idea that you are listening to and are trying to find solutions for young people who are dealing with all kinds, broad range of stuff, you know, that has impacts on you. Most people who do this work take those issues home. You can't just leave the idea of that young child in that household with nothing to eat that evening at the office. That doesn't happen, right? So how do you make sure that you recognize those things and understand that you have to begin to change some of how you relate to that? So I wanted to ask you also what your thoughts on, there are a lot of organizations now that are instituting mandatory sabbaticals, right? For some executive level, some mid-management level. And I find it fascinating because what it does, at least for me, it shows that there's a distinction between a 2-week vacation versus a longer period of time to reset, recharge, and get recentered. What are your thoughts on the necessities of sabbaticals, particularly for people who do this kind of frontline work?
Sabbaticals are necessary. That's great. That's good. And if you take a sabbatical and the environment of work has not changed, you're going right back into what you were trying to get away from. So I can be given a sabbatical and have all this wonderful time, but if I go right back into the toxicity, then it's not changing anything. It's like a cycle, a circle that's just spinning around and around and around. So the sabbaticals, I think, are good for people, who need them. And we definitely I think everyone needs more than just 2 weeks of vacation, but the organization has to work to change itself so that the person who comes back from sabbatical is actually sustained in that work environment.
So part of what you're saying is that there needs to be a disruption of this cycle of depleting yourself, going to get replenished, only to come back and deplete yourself again.
That's right. You got it. That's exactly it.
Okay. So that again is talking about restructuring a lot of how this work has to happen. And so on a practical level, then what are some, and you probably, I don't want to, have you do an organizational restructuring kind of approach here, but, we really are talking about changing how much of this work is done, because we have organizations that are 110% committed. Many of them started by people who started in their basements or whatever, right? And they have limited resources, right? They're competing with other organizations for grants, right? There are all of these dynamics that really challenge people's ability to really want to create these boundaries or be able to create these boundaries and be able to function in a more healthy and sustainable way. But practically, some of those conditions don't really exist. So what do we say to many of these people, these younger EDs, these younger program directors who are professionally driven, like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make this work, I'm going to plow through, right? What do we say to them along their journey of becoming, further professionals in this area?
You had said a word that was very interesting. You said they're professionally driven.
Yes.
They're professionally driven. And one thing that I've been questioning for myself, and even what I refer to as the before times, before COVID, is what is driving us? What is our model? Who is defining success for us? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of people who will come into whatever profession it is and have big goals. And then we have social media where everybody is posting their success and the next big thing and overcoming this and taking down that and passing this law and advocating for that. And if you look at those external images, it makes it look like people are invincible and that they are working 24/7. Like there's hardly ever a pause. And so one of my things is that I question if sometimes we need to scale back. And if scaling back can still be just as effective. Sometimes what happens with people in startups, whether it's nonprofit, a small business, people have these very big ideas and big ambitions, and those are great, but they don't have the bandwidth to actually sustain that. And so why not start with something that you can sustain and going for the smaller grants that you can sustain? You would be surprised at how big of an impact that you can make when you are working in a way where you can handle You can handle all of that's required of you. Because a lot of times, sometimes, like now, anti-racism, DEI, is like the new hot thing. And I see people changing and hiring and doing all this stuff at lightning speed, but they really haven't changed on the inside. So is that going to last? Is it going to change to unroot all that supremacy and racism that, just like vicarious trauma, is built up over time? Racial trauma is built up over time. We're talking about years, centuries. It takes time to undo that. And so for me, I feel like some of us need a little bit more patience and to scale back on some of the things that we do and not look at it as a failure, because we also need to pay attention to these bodies and our health. Our bodies are going to tell us if we're in alignment or not. We got to pay attention to our nervous systems. I didn't even get into that. That would be another conversation for another time. But it seems that people need to be realistic and at the same time aspirational about what it is that we're trying to do. I'm going to stop there because there's more that I would want to say, but it's not like coming out as clearly as I would like it to.
Understood.
But I hope that made sense.
It made a lot of sense. And it sounds like also that if we are talking about sustainability, we need to interrogate exactly what we mean and sustainable for what. Because if we're talking about sustainability to keep programming going, if we're talking about sustainability to keep services going, sustainability to keep the institution moving, then even then that is extractive, right? Even then that is not about investing in the wellness, not only of your staff, but also because when you talk about investing in the wellness of your staff, the theory is that that in turn will also improve the quality of the services that they provide.
Exactly.
Right. But if people are using sustainability in a way to continue to extract, like, yes, how do we keep you moving for the longest term possible? You know what I mean? So I'm saying that to say that I think that, you know, we can use language to our benefit however we want to. So we can talk about sustainability, you know, if we are, you know, if we're talking about we have no desire rather to change the structure of how we're doing things. If we still intending on being extractive of it, sustainability won't mean much. Exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we also have to look at, in terms of the way that we work with these movements and the variety of work that all of you who are tuning in are doing, is that really in step and in line with a capitalistic model in terms of the way that we function? So we need new ways of working and new models of success. So we really have to gently, what I would say, interrogate everything and question who told us what success is, who told us what work is, what is making it. If you don't reach a particular goal by a certain time, are you a failure? Mm-hmm. Are you willing to push yourself beyond the limit and damage yourself physically, emotionally, and mentally just to prove a point? Is it really worth it? And for some people, I know that they say, I will lay down my life for this.
That's right.
I've heard people say that. I believe in it so much, I will give my life for it. Okay, so if that's your belief, that is your belief, then look at also what will happen to those around you who love you when that life is no longer present, because you pushed yourself beyond the limit for the work, for the cause, for the movement. Why does it have to be either or? Why can't it be a both and?
You know, this was a good segue, because part of what I wanted to talk about was modeling. You know, one of the reasons I was excited about engaging in this conversation, and I was joking with my wife, was like, I hope I don't make this group full of Lumumba, because this is really something that I absolutely 100% need. And I had to make adjustments in my life because of vicarious trauma. I had to quit a job because of vicarious trauma. I had to change my lifestyle because of all of that. But one of the things that I realized that I'm also, again, attempting to unlearn is, I would say, most of, if not all of the mentors I have modeled a very unhealthy way of doing the work. I have far too many mentors who have worked themselves to an early grave. People who should still be here, who died from preventable illnesses, people who prided themselves on 3 hours of sleep because they wanted to make sure they got the minutes out from the meeting the next day, later that night, all of those things, right? And when I look at how their particular practice has impacted so many people, it was modeling. No, they did not say you should only get 3 hours. They never said that. But the modeling of it seems to be far more impactful. And so if you can talk a little bit about the responsibility of those in leadership to model something different. And so we talk about, institutionalizing some things, yes, but what about modeling?
Modeling is important. And earlier in our conversation, when I was talking about everybody looking at their own environment in terms of their elders, your culture, going back in that ancestry to look at what habits were passed down. Leaders have to do the same thing. When you come into leadership, whether you're starting this organization, this movement, or you are stepping in and you're filling in somebody else's shoes, leaders have a responsibility to take an assessment of what are the needs today. Okay, that was productivity in 1960, in 1970. What is the level of productivity that is required for 2022 that will also allow everyone who was working around me to have a sense of internal balance and well-being while we do this work? Of course, no leader is responsible for what somebody does, in their own personal life. I'm not saying that everybody is perfect. People have their own issues and things that they do to self-sabotage themselves. But leaders set the example also by practicing boundaries themselves, by taking some vacation and encouraging their own staff to do. Like, I know my co-director at the seminary that I met, when she goes off the grid, she puts a little quote as to like, I'm off the grid, I'm not answering any electronics. I encourage you to schedule some time to do the same. Little things like that. And so I'm sure that every time somebody gets that message from her, even me, we're very good friends, I'm like, you know what? I do need to step away from the gadgets and the computer and the tablet and the phone. Like, I need to step away from that. And so people need to hear leaders say these things. They need to actually hear them and see them do it. And the leaders have to be comfortable enough with knowing that in doing those things, that it's not a weakness.
That's right.
It's not a weakness. Again, taking vacation does not mean you're lazy, good people. It actually means you're smart. And take a real vacation, not a vacation where you're taking the computer and like, oh, I just got a couple work meetings, or you taking a vacation. Sometimes taking a vacation with your family is not vacation, depending on the family. Or if you go in some place, they may have you working, but a real vacation, something that is transformative. I'll add one other thing. There are different types of practices that we engage in. We can engage in escape, which I referred to earlier. Sometimes I just got to get away. That's healthy. We can engage in our basic self-care. We can engage in things that are self-nurturing, which usually has that compassionate, soothing component to it. And then we can engage in actions that are transformative, that transform us in healthy ways that we never imagined, like we're completely different. We feel like we're reborn when we come out of engaging in that particular thing. We need a mix of all of those. If leaders share a little bit of that without feeling like that they're crossing a professional boundary, then that encourages these staff as well. So leaders need to communicate with their direct reports, who then can communicate with the next line of workers.
Yeah, and I think, even by some of the more professionally traditional metrics, leaders are going to be forced to really look at their ability to continue to function in the same manner. Many people, I'm sure have seen the New York Times report that talked about X number of million people resigned from their jobs in November. In November alone, millions of people across this country resigned from their jobs, right? So what does that mean for workforce? What does that mean for how things are structured? What does that mean for people coming in to take some of those jobs if the same conditions exist What is there to say that that number won't continue to, if not rise, be the same moving forward in December and in other places? So this is all extremely, extremely informative. And I think we have, first of all, the chat is popping. So we want to open up the floor for some questions from the audience.
If you could just, if you could just put it into the chat, we can read them out and get your questions addressed.
That would be really, really great. And as folks are doing that, again, I really want to encourage those of you who are pursuing professional careers in some of these spaces to really talk about, really begin to think about ways that you actually have now an invitation to reimagine what these spaces can actually look like. The world is not the same that we knew prior to 2020. This is the time to change things. This is the time to switch things up as much as possible. You talked about the metrics that we looked at in the 70s of what was effective. And I'll be honest, if we really had a more honest assessment, we would really, I think, come to different conclusions as to whether or not those were effective, as well. But being really courageous, being really imaginative to create something different that is more aligned, that is effective, that is long-term, that's sustainable in a real way. So I started talking and did not look at the chat.
Oh, no, I can just pull out one. Yeah.
Okay, please.
Can I say one thing?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Before you go to the first question, and that is, Lumumba, I want to thank you for what you just said in terms of sustainable for everyone. Whatever you're creating, make sure that it matches your life values. What are your core values? That's how you make something stick. So whatever your core value is, make your actions, the things that you're doing, match those core values. So if your core value is family, then you need some sustainable self-care strategies that deal with your family. If it's friendships, it needs to be around that. If it's joy, you need to create a sustainable self-care joy practice. Have them match your core values. And that's in your organizations too. What is your vision? What is your mission statement? Is wellness in there? Pull out those core values and have the changes that you implement match that. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Caroline Richardson, she's a supervisor, and she's saying, how do you manage supporting your staff in terms of vicarious trauma and boundaries while still upholding the mandates that are required by jobs for the company, state, or federal? And I just want to add into this too, in our workforce, with youth workers, there are a lot of people that are hourly workers and are barely even compensated for having an hour to prep, right? So how do we think of them in this situation too? That's the first question.
Carolyn Richardson, I believe this is?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I've had this come up from supervisors before, especially if your staff that you're supervising has other traumas that are intersecting with that vicarious trauma. That can be very difficult. One of the things that it's important to do is, I feel, is to create a relationship with your staff, is that when you see signs of the vicarious trauma, to actually let them know that you see what's going on, invite them to speak with you, to connect with you about it, and talk about what is it that we can change to lessen some of the effects of this. So let's say that I know that you have your mandates, but is there something that perhaps that staff person is not able to do because of vicarious trauma that could be handed off to someone else? And then for that someone else, maybe something that could be taken from them and given to the other staff person, kind of like doing a swap up until they're getting in their self-care practice. So those effects of vicarious trauma start coming down and they're not showing the symptoms as much, like they're in their healing process, so to speak. So I would start doing things like that, shifting around some of the duties, but making sure that one person is not carrying more than they should, because you don't want to pile it on to someone else. And then being honest as a supervisor, go to your superior, for lack of a better word, and let them know what's going on so that you can get the support. It should not always be on one person. That's the issue. You as a supervisor, you need your resources to share with your staff, and then the people above you as the supervisor, they need to back you up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I know that we're going to see, and I see some of the other questions coming up, that what's going to be consistent in this process is we're talking about changing the way things are done. We're talking about changing ourselves individually. We're talking about changing our individual departments. We're talking about changing the institutions. We're talking about changing the profession and the landscape. All of those things, I think, require us to do both an internal and external assessment of what our responsibility is to change some of those things. So yes, we will have to talk to our supervisors. Yes, we will actually have to have conversations around policies that need to be shifted statewide that really reflect some of the things that need to be happening. So I do want to say that we're going to continuously have this conversation around internal and external responsibilities to change these realities.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Lumumba, because we have, Caroline was telling she's at a middle management, I'm assuming, or supervisory level, but other people are also saying, like, how do we really push this with EDs to recognize vicarious trauma and others? And Lumumba, we were having some, or for everybody, we were having some conversations about how to build power in the youth work sector. And we're going to have to keep pushing those conversations, which is more about kind of capitalism and extractive practices. And
we haven't, yeah, and we haven't used that language here yet, but we cannot avoid it. Yeah. We can't avoid it. That what we're doing is really talking about dismantling capitalism. If we're being really honest, what we are doing is really talking about dismantling, because all of this really is an exploitive, extractive approach to labor, to work, right? And we're talking about really reconstructing this and constructing something totally different. And we can't really avoid, I mean it changes the politics of what people may think they're hearing, but we can't avoid it. This is actually what we're attempting, what we're going to have to do, right? So let's get to the other questions. I'm sorry.
Okay, so Luis Gamero was saying, do you have any advice on how to prevent BT leading to countertransference?
That's a great question. So a lot of times people confuse countertransference with vicarious trauma, but just so I make sure I understand the question, vicarious trauma leading to countertransference? That's interesting, because I usually have had people experience the other way around, where there's countertransference that leads to vicarious trauma.
Luis, do you want to jump in? You can be unmuted if you wanted to clarify for us. Can someone from our events team unmute Luis, if that's okay? Oh, hey,
hello.
Nice
there we
to
go.
see you.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for this, by the way. This is awesome. No, what I meant was, you know how sometimes if we are jaded by an experience that we may have had helping, clients, how that may influence our next interaction with another client, or with, let's say, somebody that we're, going to be helping. And all that experience and all that trauma that we're carrying, just transferring that towards them and not really listening to what their specific or individualistic needs will be. So then kind of just pushing our sort of like, oh, if this is what you're doing in the past, I know that this has happened, so let me just help you. And this is what you have to do, as opposed to really individualizing the care. So that influence, that's what I was talking about.
Okay, thank you for that. So we were talking about you as the person who is in the position of support, stopping yourself from carrying that on to the next person that you're supporting. Okay, all right, got it. So one of the things that you can do for yourself is, after any of us have dealt with someone who is really activated our vicarious trauma, and we are aware, remember the A for awareness, that we have these symptoms going on, is that we need to pause and not jump to the next client yet, until we've resolved some of these issues in ourselves. So whatever that practice is for you, let's say that you're working with someone, let's say you're in supervision with someone. have a space to process in supervision how that client affected you and the things that you saw came up in you. And then once you start with your own practices and you have a handle on that, and you're like, okay, I'm good now. I'm at a place where I'm grounded, I'm centered. Doesn't have to be 100%, but you're well enough to know that you're not going to carry this and allow this to be projected onto someone else. Then you engage in the work again. Then you move on to the next person. But you yourself, I would suggest you, anyone, any of us, we need someone to talk to so we can process that. Because if we don't get it out and we're carrying it inside, it's going to show up somewhere else because we haven't released it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
I want to go back to some of the questions about ways that we could push this at the executive level, because I think, Lumumba, you were talking about the context. We are in the moment of great resignation. We do have labor movements and worker centers kind of gathering some momentum in this period of time. So there's more worker power. And in the youth work field, I mean, I've never seen so many job postings. Like, it's an amazing time for people exiting our program to be picky and to kind of say that organizations.
Okay, Sarah, I'm going to see if I can make out what you said. I think what you were asking is there research that people can take to their EDs, CEOs, whoever is the leader of the organization, showing that when you institute wellness practices, that it actually is better for everyone. Okay, all right, so I got it. So you know what, I'm sure there is, and I'm going to take this opportunity to show this now. Powerful book for anyone who hasn't heard of it, and I have this on the list that you're going to receive, Trauma Stewardship. So many people praise this book. It has been used by a variety of people who are doing all kinds of work, helping others, social services, social justice, anti-violence, advocating for many different things. This book, it says an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. And there's research in this book, and thank you, someone just said excellent read. So, and there also are research studies that talk about the effects of mindfulness on the body, the effects of meditation, what that does for someone, and also available on Audible. Wonderful, wonderful. So we got some endorsements for trauma stewardship. But if you just Google or use another search engine to pull things up, there are articles that exist. But you can also just go to the simple articles that show that these practices actually are proven scientifically to help us as human beings. And so there's a bunch of stuff. I don't have any research studies to cite for you in this moment, but I know it's out there.
Mm-hmm. I want to add something also to this, because I think the conversation around EDs and how we get them to move is important. And I know I'm focusing on people who are not EDs, but who are sure to ascend to those particular positions. It's important that we shift some of how we actually do our work, right? When we talk about sharing the workload, taking some stuff off your plate, many people have this ownership of projects that don't allow them to actually give it to, I see you shaking your head, Luis, you know what I'm talking about, right? That don't allow them to actually give it to other people because, oh, they're not going to do it correctly. And I think what's important is to make some distinctions between people doing things correctly versus doing things the way you would do it, right? As somebody who's created amazing programs and recognized I needed to turn it over, right? It's going to look different. It should look different, right? But being real clear that just because it's not done your way does not mean it's done incorrectly. And we have to be okay with that. We have to make space for it to actually look different, for it to really begin to, reflect a different set of eyes and imagination. Okay. Let's see. Sarah, I see you saying you have some trouble with your connection. Let me see. As a youth worker in the shelter system, I'm sorry. Trying to see what other questions I may have missed. What is your best advice for initiating this conversation with senior leadership? We just covered that. What are some other ways we can bring the conversation? So the idea of presenting this to leadership is coming up like repeatedly. So that really is an indication that this is going to be something that leadership is going to have to do.
Lumumba, one thing that I would also add to that is
Please.
for anybody who wants to engage with senior leadership, you don't do it by yourself. You do it with a collective. So you get other people on board with you and you take it to leadership as a collective, because leadership often will not respond to one voice. Sometimes it's because that one voice could just go at the bottom of the to-do list of things to do. But when there is a collective number of voices going to leadership, that shows unity. And then people tend to sit up and pay attention and respond more promptly.
Thank you. And Jessica, I appreciate you saying that, because that's what I was getting ready to say as well. Like board trustees, board directors have a significant role that needs to be played in here. I sit on 3 boards. And one of the things that I am always talking about is how do we sustain the staff? Like, how do we make sure that people are not burnt out? What are some things that we're putting in place? And that actually helps to direct executive directors to move accordingly. If their bosses are suggesting it, that makes a difference. But I also want to include something else that unfortunately matters as well, which is philanthropy. Unfortunately, philanthropy plays the songs that organizations, CBOs have to dance to, right? If they are mandating that these particular projects get done within a certain amount of time period and they want X numbers of reports, sometimes all of that stuff is problematic, right? And if we can also get them to recognize the kind of adjustments that need to be made, those things actually help also to move organizational leadership into the right place. Tatiana, could you put your question in the chat?
What I have found as in my own experience, I work with a homeless organization. It's that there's a lot of white guilt and class guilt when it comes to addressing wellness issues. Oftentimes, when, at least from my experience and my observations, right, is that there is this sense of there's a sense of giving. Like you have to get, like you have to expect.
A little bit there. It was Keisha Marlin, as a youth worker in the shelter system. I come across you.
Hold on one second. I'm sorry. If everyone else other than Tatiana, if you can put yourselves on mute, that would be great. Go ahead, Tatiana. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. So what I noticed was that there's this sense in the nonprofit world, like a lot of these nonprofits that are, holding people, filling the gaps that the government is not able to provide. So there's this sense that there's an expectation of almost like not getting the right working conditions. There's almost this sense that I'm going to this nonprofit world, therefore I'm expected to earn less or have less vacation time and all these sense, and it comes from this sense of white guilt, like honestly, like and a class and obviously class. And so my question was related to how to make a conversation around wellness in a way that helps those who suffer, I use the word suffer, from guilt in a way, right? How to engage more humility in allowing everybody, including myself as a worker, to know that the sense of giving, it's not sustainable when working conditions are not right.
Got it. Okay. I'm not DeShannon if you got the question, but so you can take it if you understood the question.
So what I'm going to ask is this is how I'm summarizing it for myself. Is it seems that the issue is, and someone just put it in the chat, is addressing racism, and wellness has been racialized, and wellness means different things to different people. And I think what sometimes happens in these systems is in these working environments is that we have to look at who is setting the standard of what wellness is, what giving is, and how someone should work. And so, Tatiana, where I would start is having an honest conversation about how guilt and white guilt gets in the way. And it actually disrupts racial equity,
Right.
especially when you're trying to deliver services. And so we have to really look at, are our expectations realistic when we're in these environments, and where is racism showing up? Where is entitlement showing up within the organization? Because different people will define these things in different ways. That's the first thing that came to me. I don't know, Lumumba, if you had more to add.
That's very much in line with what I was going to say. Absolutely, that, you know, if people are coming to this work out of guilt, they need to find somewhere else to be. If you're coming to this work to actually change material conditions, then we'll make room for you. But also understanding that you're coming to this work with your own identity, with your own history, and that within that comes some very specific responsibilities as well. So if you are coming from a very well-off white community, you actually need to make sure that you aren't bringing some of that into your space, into our community spaces, saying, you know, how we need to organize or serve our communities better. That is not welcomed. That absolutely is not welcomed. So there are ways that you actually have to come to this work to be able to be clear about what your purpose is, what's driving you, because if it's charity, this ain't it. This ain't it at all. Okay, so thank you for that question. That's helpful. I see Ashley asks, what are some ways we can present this conversation to families in our communities and young people, since I know so many of them also deal with vicarious trauma and could benefit from dismantling a lot of these ideas as well.
So now we're talking more personally, like families and our young people. Great, because that's really where it needs to go. Because if we can have these conversations in families, then it's like we're being equipped, and we know what to expect when we go into certain lines of work. And so one way to do it is really to start having conversations about what trauma is and what happens when we are in traumatic situations, you know, over a long period of time. When we're in a family situation, especially folks who are in different fields who don't know a lot about trauma, let alone vicarious trauma, we got to make our language and style of communication accessible. So it needs to be simple. I believe with children that we need to speak very honestly with them about how work impacts us. That's right, plain talk, plain talk. Let them know how the work impacts us. Let them know why we're taking a vacation or a sabbatical, and how that's important, and how that they have the right to go into these places and expect to be treated a certain kind of way. Like my father, may he rest and dwell in power, would every morning talk about, all right, I'm going to work on the plantation. I'm going to work on a plantation. He used to work at what now is Boeing, what many of us know is Boeing here in the US. But that word plantation associated with work for me made me like shrivel up, like plantation. And he would just kind of like have a heavy sigh when he would go to work. And so these conversations about work and these conversations about trauma can actually start with people in our families very young. We can start doing well practices and inviting our families into it. Like, okay, baby, we about to do our mountain pose. We about to do some deep breathing together. Like, you know, the kid, you know, upsets you, then you can also do some deep breathing is like yourself. They may ask you, mommy, daddy, auntie, grandma, whoever, Baba, why are you doing that? I need to calm down. I'm feeling activated. What's activated? And then you tell your kid what activated means, and I'm laughing. But yes, modeling, Lumumba, exactly. If we start that and introducing that early, then we're actually equipping them with what they will need to not just survive, because we don't want to just survive and get by. We want to thrive. We want to thrive. Yes, the work is hard. Yes, it's heartbreaking, but that does not mean that we are destined to a life of suffering.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are coming to the close of this very necessary discussion, and I can tell by number one, the numbers of people that have joined this call and the interactions in the chat, the questions. But we want to use this as an invitation for you all to dig deeper into this conversation around vicarious trauma, dig deeper into the conversation around self-care, and really recommit ourselves to changing the relationships we have with our profession, with the landscape, and reimagining what this can actually look like as we attempt to continue the work to change the material conditions of our community, particularly our young people. So, Reverend DeShannon Bowens, I'm going to ask you to give us some closing words. I know you're going to share some resources that will be sent out later. But if you can just give us some closing words, and then we'll turn it over to Sarah, I believe, to close us out.
Okay, well, first of all, I see that there were questions that we didn't get to, so I apologize for the questions that we didn't get to. We did our best to try to keep up with it. It's just proof that we need to do this more often. So I first want to just thank you all for actually coming and starting off the new year the way that you are, because you are making your wellness a priority. And by showing up here tonight, you made the statement that you matter and that you want to make a change. So the first thing that we have to do is show up for ourselves. When we are impacted by this work, in work settings, family life, because vicarious trauma happens outside of work too, we need to know those safer spaces where we can be held. And so what I am wishing for everyone is to find the person that you can talk to and that you can connect with, so that you can have support on making the changes that you want to make in your life. Because you are that important, and the work that you do matters. And I want to thank you all for the work that you do and how you show up. And again, thank Lumumba and CUNY, SPS, and Sarah, and everybody who helped facilitate this and make it flow so smoothly as it did.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much, both to Professor Bandele and to Iya Reverend DeShannon Bowens, to helping us learn how to care for ourselves, to create a culture of care in our orgs, and also really to push for more worker power in our sector, and to think about this transition to something other than extractive capitalism. So what a wonderful way to set off our year. What a wonderful way to set off this series. So much gratitude to you two and to our events team, Heather, Zima, Molly Joyce, Ryan Davila, and Javier Saavedra. And thank you always to Shania Rojas, my Youth Studies Program Coordinator, co-conspirator in all things. And thank you to all of you who spent your time with us tonight. We know that it's a lot to build with people after a full day of work. So thank you for being with us, and come next week, do it again. We have our event, We Keep Us Safe, where Professor Bandele will be speaking with Quentin Walcott and Juan Ramos about alternatives to policing. So have a wonderful night. It was so wonderful to be with you here. Thank you.